Speaking of honor, Archbishop Lefebvre. I'd like to talk a little bit about him. You know, he was in 1968, 1969. He was retiring. He had evangelized a greater portion of Africa.
Yeah.
He had been the superior of his order, the Holy Ghost Fathers. He had fought hard at Vatican II against the modernists. He had participated in the Ottaviani intervention. He had fought for the liturgy. He could have retired. He could have been done in 1968 and 1969. But then in 1970, when the new mass comes out and there's a lot of confusion, he didn't do what he had to do by duty. I mean, I guess in a strict sense he did, but he did something honorable. And I think there's a lot of people watching, even especially who watch my channel, who don't know who Lefebvre is. He's a boogeyman. He started the Society of St. Pius X in 1970. That was bad. That was wrong. We can't have that. And so I think it'd be good for us to have a conversation and just talk about, I mean, he's not technically the founder of traditionalism. Like you said, we're just talking about Catholicism, authentic Catholicism.
Right.
But this counter-Reformation, he is the pivotal figure, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And part of the reason I can say that with absolute certitude is because I lived through that. I was young, but I lived through it. And I remember what it was like right after the council, and especially after 1969, when the new mass came in. And there was a sense that it was all over. And there was a sense that we needed to go underground. But that wasn't a solution. That was just like survival, you know? And I always say to people that as far as I'm concerned, Michael Davies said of my father, he said, if there wasn't for Walter Matt, there wouldn't be a traditional Catholic movement, certainly in the States and maybe not in the world. Now, whether you agree with that or not, that's not the point. My point is that's what I looked at my own father's role in all this. It was pivotal. It was huge. And yet I'm the first one to admit that if it hadn't been for Lefebvre, and I say this, I insist on this, because my father insisted on this. He was a layman. You can't change the hierarchy of the church from a layman's point of view. That's not what Bishop Fulton Sheen was talking about when he said the laity would save the church, because he specifically says, make sure your priests act like priests. Sheen now. Make sure your priests act like priests and your bishops act like bishops. That's what he meant by the laity. So my father would be the first to admit that it wasn't until Archbishop Lefebvre came in. He was a council father. He signed most of the art. There's always this debate about how many of the documents. My point is he was a signatory on the documents of Vatican II. He was there. He was, absolutely a high-ranking, a powerful position, prince of the church. And that's what changed everything. And that's, if you look at it, the Vatican has been in a panic ever since Archbishop Lefebvre did what he did, which shows what one bishop, one prince of the church can do. Think about it. The Motu Proprio Ecclesiae Dei, what was that about? It was all about Archbishop Lefebvre.
Right.
Again, I lived through that. That was 88. It was all about Archbishop Lefebvre. Even the Motu Proprium Summorum Pontificum of Benedict XVI, what's that about? That's all about trying to fix that quote-unquote schism of the SSPX. The Vatican has been very concerned. Francis comes along, who he seems to be clueless about so many things regarding the various, elements within traditional Catholicism or in the church. He just condemns everybody to the right of EWTN at this point. But for some reason, Francis is very aware of the SSPX, and he's done odd things like granted them permission for confession and marriage and all. So what Lefebvre did is not objectively speaking, it absolutely changed history. Because the church is hierarchical. So I always say, whether you like Lefebvre, you think he was right or wrong, you simply cannot underestimate the impact that the man had. He changed everything. And he brought the traditional Latin Mass back because he said, fine, I'm going to go off. I'm going to start my own society, and the traditional Mass will survive. So then the Vatican began backtracking a little bit and allowing the traditional Latin Mass. So if you're enjoying the Latin Mass right now, you simply cannot separate that privilege to have the traditional Latin Mass, that right to have the traditional Latin Mass, from what happened in 1988 with Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre.
Yeah. Let's talk about how the whole thing got started. So the council ends in 1965. We start seeing a lot of liturgical innovations. In 1969, which this is notable, it was mentioned at the Catholic Identity Conference, we're in the 50th anniversary of the Novus Ordo. Think about that,
right,
folks. It was promulgated in 1969. We're in 2019. So it's been 50 years. The fact that we're even talking about the Latin Mass 50 years later, after it was allegedly abrogated, Benedict says it never was. It's a difficult debate. Why did Lefebvre do what he did? Why did he start a seminary? Why did he start the society?
Well, again, it's a great story because you said he could have retired. He did retire. He was in retirement.
Mm-hmm.
He had been one of the most successful missionaries of the 20th century with the Holy Ghost Fathers in Africa. They still talk about him in Africa.
Yeah.
He's a legendary status, So he had already retired. And I think that then when things really, the wheels began to come off, the whole Vatican II experiment very early on, and that people say, well, it didn't start at Vatican II. That's true. Guess where it started? It started in the schools, started in the seminaries back in the 20s and 30s, where modernism was really making inroads into the church. So it wasn't like, well, just between 1969 and 1970, all the seminaries went to hell and suddenly Lefebvre had to come to the rescue. That had been a long time in coming, back to the liturgical revolution. I'm from Minnesota. A lot of it happened up in Collegeville, Minnesota. That was sort of the epicenter out in the prairie where they really started getting things going, like the dialogue mass and everything else. So by the time the council hit, all of these things came out of the closet, and the leaders of these movements came out of the closet. The modernists now were emboldened. And so Lefebvre started his seminary because young men came to him and they said, we're not getting formation. We can't go through with this. This is not Catholic, what's happening in the seminary. And again, God bless him, this old retired man said, I guess I'm not done. My work's not done. And so he came out and tried again, I think we talked about this last time, but anybody who thinks they know something about Lefebvre and yet still continues to insist that he was a renegade and he was disobedient, you've simply never read him. You never read his books. You never read his papers. Yeah, because he came out and he did everything he possibly could to try to get the situation with the Vatican rectified, because he was suspended in 1976 over ordinations, and then after 1988 he was excommunicated, quote unquote. He was latente sensi, in other words, automatic excommunication. But he tried. The point is, he tried to do everything he possibly could to fix that. This is not a schismatic mentality to try desperately. Usually, a schismatic is pretty proud of the fact that they're broken from authority. He didn't consider himself to have broken from authority. Prayed for the Pope at every single mass, as did all of his priests then and now, and was always trying to keep the communication open. So what was happening was a crisis of revolution in the church, and Archbishop Lefebvre did everything he possibly could to restore it without compromising the faith, which was his first order, his first obligation before God, was to defend the faith that has been handed down to him, which I think is his motto. He defended what was given to him. So that's essentially, that's in a nutshell, his motto is why he started his seminary, to answer your question, because he knew he had an obligation before God to pass on what had been given to him. And that was the old faith. And the old faith was simply buried, deep sick, destroyed, hidden in that time period, and so he had an obligation to stand and defend it. And because of that, history changed rather dramatically because of one son of the church, and two, because Castro Mayor of Campos, Brazil, his sort of cohort, was with him. So those two bishops really did, during that time period, change everything.
Yep. I remember I was reading his biography, and I got to admit, I used to be very anti-Lefebvre. When I first came into traditionalism and was attending the Latin Mass the first 4 or 5 years, I was programmed by priests to see Lefebvre as a Luther, to see the society as schismatic, renegade, anti-papal, anti-tradition. But as I began to read about him, I remember reading an account early on. It was in it was either France or England, and he was observing that the Methodists were allowed to have an ordination rite in the Catholic cathedral. The Methodists. And yet he and the society were told they cannot celebrate the old Mass in that Catholic cathedral. I think it was England. Do you know this story, Michael?
Yeah.
And he was saying, how sad it is that this cathedral, with all of its side altars and chapels and whatnot, all of that was built for the old Mass. Mm-hmm. He said, this is the Mass that I said on the day after my ordination. I've said it ever since. How can they say I can't say it? And how can Methodists have invalid ordination rites in the cathedral? They're allowed to use the Catholic cathedral, but we are not allowed to say the Mass of the Ages in there. And reading that, I mean, it was a firework in my mind. It's like, he has a great point. You cannot argue against this kind of logic. And it shows that the bishops and the leaders of these cathedrals are allowing them to be rented out by Protestants, by people who don't even believe in ordination, apostolic succession. They can use the cathedral, but the Latin Mass can't be celebrated there. And once you see that contradiction, you begin to realize that Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre was on the right side of history. You
Right.
begin to see that the narrative that you read in Athanasius, where he's condemned allegedly by synods and he's cast out of churches and the hierarchy turns against him, you begin to realize that this is being lived out in the 1900s.
Absolutely, and that contradiction that you're bringing up, it reminds me a little bit of what was going on in France during the Revolution, where you had, the peasants went and they were so infuriated by what was happening to their state, to their king, to their altar, that they found that the members of the gentry or of the nobility to lead them, a guy like Francois Charette, for example. And so I think it's important to credit the lay people too, even in the case of Lefebvre, who just absolutely saw this beast and said, no, there's no way this is Catholic. I cannot go along with this. And so there was a hue and cry. There was a March on Rome in 1972, I think. My father was involved with that. Michael Davies was involved with that. A literal March on Rome that involved, I think, well over 10,000. I remember the number of people who marched literally on the Vatican. There were lay people all over the world who did not go along with this. So Lefebvre, he wasn't the one who was saying, I'm going to lead a movement in opposition to you. The movement came to him, and it was represented by some young lay people, laymen, seminarians, who went to him and said, we need you to start a seminary. And so I think we can all look back on that situation and be pretty proud of our forefathers, lay people, and obviously Archbishop Lefebvre, who answered the call, who saw it, who knew something was wrong as well. And together they formed this movement. But my point is what you just talked about, that obvious attack on tradition and on the buildings and on the faith and on the liturgy and the inconsistency, the double standards that was going on against tradition in favor of this ecumenical outreach in all directions, everyone saw that. And I think that was why it was so easy to do what they did, because they knew this can't possibly be Catholic, it can't possibly be right, and we have the authority of sacred tradition to stand on, because either tradition was wrong for 1,965 years, or what's happening here is wrong. It had to be one of the two, because it was such a diametric opposition. They were diametrically opposed to each other, the two positions. And so again, that speaks to where we get our authority to stand and resist. It comes from tradition. And that's exactly what Lefebvre knew. It comes from tradition. This can't be, because it's an indictment of the history of the church. So we have to stand with tradition against this novelty that was being literally just shoved down the throats of priests and lay people and bishops all across the world with the apparent blessing of the Pope.
Yeah, at the Catholic Information Conference, I read that condemnation that Lefebvre made with Bishop Castro Meyer against the idolatry in 1986.
Exactly.
I read it. And I said, who do you think said this? And it was kind of quiet, and the assumption was this was Bishop Schneider or, Cardinal Burke or someone like this. And I said, this is 1986.
And important, you just held up that book by Bishop Tissier, another book by Dr. David Allen White, a friend of mine, who did a biography of Archbishop Lefebvre. And you really, this is so, if you go and look at where this man came from as far as his family roots, it's like reading something from the Lives of the Saints, where sisters who were nuns, brothers who were priests, very saintly. His father died in a concentration camp, for heaven's sakes, Archbishop Lefebvre's father.
His mother was very holy.
Oh my gosh, a really very holy family that brought several vocations out of their large family. And you can see that this was just a loyal, absolutely loyal, humble Catholic man who was destroyed by revolution in the church and did everything he could to stop it. So please, if you're thinking of him as a rebel, please read some of those biographies and move away from that position. It simply isn't true. It literally, I think 88, you could argue that it killed Archbishop Lefebvre, finding himself in opposition. And I asked Bishop Schneider in my interview if he ever envisioned himself standing in opposition to the Pope, to the Vatican. He said, never in my life did I ever imagine I would be saying anything against what's happening from the chair of Peter. Yeah. So it's a similar situation. A priest, a bishop certainly does not want to be in that position. And it's a very peculiar and difficult position. And it takes courage to be there. And some of them are just strong enough, just Catholic enough, and just heroic enough to stand alone and do it.